welcome to the House of ZK Radio, which is a focused podcast and media channel exploring everything ZK, zero knowledge. I'm Alice, host of House of ZK Radio and also education lead at CKN. Today, I'm joined here with co-host Pavel from House of ZK and our guest Michael, who is co-founder of Hibachi. I'm very excited to have you today here with us, Michael.
Also, very excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm wondering if we can first start off with an introduction of yourself. So how you got into the Web3 space and how you got into ZK as well.
Sure, yeah. I started out in Web 2 at Facebook, kind of focused on the systems that ensure kind of security and privacy of the site. So trying to figure out how to make sure people's data doesn't get scraped, fake account detection, things like that. And so eventually was able to leave and move on to brighter crypto pastures. And so I joined a crypto startup, Hasher, which is a decentralized exchange, and kind of built and led the engineering team there to build, which I think was a very cool RFQ platform. And eventually, I think we kind of took that um, as far as that kind of technology was going to go for the use case, and started thinking about um, more fundamentally what's the best way to build an exchange, and if we had to start it off all from scratch. And that's kind of when I heard about ZK, and yeah, started the company, started Habachi, and now we're here. We have a mostly functional product, and we're able to finally use the technology.
Yeah, awesome. And it's really great to hear that you got your early start, like also dealing with privacy back when you were in Facebook. So lots of, I guess, like ZK motivations that came along from starting from a while back. And I wanted to also ask you a bit about some of the motivations also behind founding Hibachi. You mentioned that like one question you thought about was, well, if I had to like build an exchange from the ground up from scratch, what do I need to consider? So one thing that I saw that Hibachi really emphasizes is the fact that it's a provable exchange. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about what that entails and what the role of ZK is in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the starting question was very simple, and I think they always need to be, because if you make too many assumptions, you can go down the wrong path. And so the question was just, what is the best way to build an exchange? And over 2,000 years, there's a way of doing that, or at least for the last 20, right? And that's you build a Web 2 kind of exchange like your Robinhood or Coinbase or Binance, and you basically act as a bank, right? And so you'll take people's money, run the exchange off-chain, and you basically give them an IOU that when you give Coinbase money, you get an IOU, and hopefully at some point you can redeem that and get your money back. And uh, usually you do, and then it's a great experience. And sometimes FTX happens and you don't get your money back, and that's really not good. And so that was the that was the only way of building an exchange for a long time. And then with the advent of Web3, the decentralized exchange paradigm came along, and there's a few different takes on it and exactly how you should run the exchange with an AMM. Is it an RFQ platform? Should it be an order book exchange? But all of them kind of have this paradigm that you should just run it on the chain. And so the entire exchange now gets moved to the blockchain, because the blockchain is a kind of trusted execution environment. You know what's happening, it's transparent, and therefore you now have this new um, uh, possibility of building an exchange. And all that sounds really great in theory, and it is a very exciting innovation, but you start to take really big performance hits. And one way to think about it is, if you had to define the role of an exchange, it's really to be a um, highly centralized, highly efficient computing platform, right? You want a lot of different parties matching orders very quickly. And then if I had to define what the blockchain does, is it's a highly decentralized, very slow but very trusted environment. And so these kind of technologies are almost opposed to each other. It doesn't really make sense for an exchange, or all the things you want out of an exchange, except for the trustlessness. Um, you actually are not going to get from a blockchain. And so there's a lot of different approaches at the time around, well, how do we make the blockchain faster and faster so that eventually it can catch up. But it's not really possible to do that unless you fundamentally change what the blockchain is, right? Because if the core pattern is you have your transactions, you send them out to a bunch of different parties, everybody validates. Well, in that, there's an inherent decentralization, which is going to slow things down. And so you can try to get more centralized, and that's kind of what you've seen with um, some of the other L2s or alternative L1s, is that you build a chain that's just not very decentralized, and you try to get more speed that way. Or you can just leave it slow, which is also not good. But even if you do that, you're not going to get an exchange that's going to be that's anywhere close to what you'll get um, from the traditional approach. And so the end result of that is you leave users with kind of a difficult choice. The choice is, do you want something that's safe or do you want something that's good? And all of us like to think that safe is what people will pick, and security is very important. But the reality, and we saw this really anytime you have security, whether it's passwords, you kind of realize that security is great, except for when people have to pick a trade-off against convenience. And whenever they do, they almost always pick convenience until they get burned, right? And so you're going to use a weak password until it gets compromised, and then you might change your approach. And so it's really one lesson that people sometimes drop from that incorrectly, I think, is that people don't care about security or safety, and that's not true. Like, you want your stuff to be safe. Nobody likes to lose their money or be hacked, but it's that it's really difficult to ask people to trade that off against convenience, and that's what the current pattern and dichotomy of exchanges was forcing people to do. And so our approach was not, why don't we pick one of these lanes, but it was rather, is there a way for us to build the exchange so that people don't have to make that compromise? And if I offered you an exchange that is just as fast, but it's more safe than the traditional method, you would probably pick it, right? And so a lot of times, I think we get caught up as an industry in these trade-offs. When the reality is that it's on us to build solutions that allow the user to have their cake and eat it too. And anyway, so that was the original question: is how do we deal with these trade-offs? And that's kind of when we found out about ZK and technology. The technology at the time was still very um, early. It was still kind of a little bit too slow, too expensive, but it was getting faster. It was getting cheaper, and it was kind of starting to reach the place where you could conceivably build an exchange using ZK technology. And I think um, and really the last 2-3 years have been phenomenal there in terms of infrastructure improvements, and credit should go to the companies providing these services. That was not us. We just kind of um, leveraged that wave. And so anyway, when we started to think about it and look a little bit more into the possibility of using ZK, it became pretty clear that actually there's a way here to build an exchange that is just as fast and just as good of an experience, and you get all the convenience, but you still can prove that it's valid. And that's kind of where the provable paradigm comes in, because most people have a tough time. Most retail consumers have a tough time identifying ZK and what does it mean and why is it better for me. And so the way that we think about it is really provable versus centralized and decentralized. So the centralized way of doing things is you trust one party, they do everything, and it happens in kind of a private dark room somewhere. And then the decentralized paradigm is everything's out in the open, and everybody has a say, and that's cool, but it's not very efficient. And so the provable pattern is, well, why don't you do things in a way that's efficient and a good experience to focus on whatever interaction you want, just doing that as good as possible, and then you have the party that's running your exchange or that you're interacting with prove that everything was done correctly, right? And so that's kind of where the provable naming comes from, but really provable is not possible without ZK.
Absolutely. And I really liked how you kind of mapped us through all those trade-offs, and also that distinction with provable versus centralization, which has those, risks of not being safe, and then also decentralization, which has those trade-offs involving efficiency. So really great that you mentioned all of that. And just on this topic of trying to navigate through these trade-offs, I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about maybe why you believe trustlessness is so hard to apply to our centralized environments today, and why we have grown so accustomed to operating without trust in these environments, just trusting these entities just for free without any sort of guarantee. You had to mention those hidden costs that are related to convenience, like the trade-off that people may have to take for high performance um, high performance over latency, even if it sacrifices some security. So curious here if there are any other kinds of like hidden costs of convenience that you see that are contributing to us being so used to just putting trust automatically to these systems.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I I don't know how far to go back honestly to answer it, but I would say that um, we have the luxury now of looking at this and assuming that trustlessness should be a default, right? But for the entirety of human civilization, that was not a thing, right? And so you could not trust somebody. You could just like order something on eBay or not, like like a random marketplace, and a lot of times you're going to get scammed, right? And so um, uh, eventually, the most obvious mechanism that evolved is, well, you can have a middleman to be the arbiter of trust, right? And so if I don't know if I can trust this person, maybe I don't know them, or maybe I'm engaging in a transaction that's highly decentralized. I'm going to rely on that party to make sure that things are fine. And it's not a bad way of doing things. Like there's definitely it's definitely better than not having any trust. And so we kind of delegated our verification of trust to these middlemen, and then a lot of society evolved to just be those middlemen because, well, if you want to have money, you need a bank to hold the money, right? Um, and similar, right? Like in all sorts of other um, realms of life, is you have this party in the center that is responsible for arbitrating quality and correctness, and we basically try to solve it with just have a different party that whose responsibility it is to be the middleman, and that works sort of, but the big problem here is that humans are flawed and they're awesome, but they're also selfish, and it's very difficult to get people's incentives to be correct. And so what kind of happened um, many times in history, but particularly I would want to say the last like 70 years of our society, is that more and more you have these middlemen and these institutions just becoming more and more selfish and kind of focused on how do I extract the most value out of this position of privilege, right? And how do I get in a position where I get to be in the middle between two parties, and then how do I extract the most of that for me, right? And that's it's an unfortunate side effect of how society works, and it kind of pushed us into a lot of dysfunctional institutions. And there wasn't really a good answer to that for the longest time, right? It was just kind of look, if you're paying close attention, you probably would get pretty depressed. And maybe the Great Financial Crisis was like the best example of, you get all these like big banks investing, taking risks on behalf of the whole society to enrich themselves, and there wasn't really a good answer to how you prevent that. But then, we have the benefit of hindsight, is we know that right around that time is when the Bitcoin white paper came out, and this new industry was born, right? And it was really offering a different way to do trust, and that would be that instead of just putting all of this power on one middleman to arbitrate everything, why don't you give it to a network of people and you use peer incentives to find a way um, to ensure correctness? And it's a really, really cool idea. It wasn't really possible before we had computers because um, the communication would be too slow, right? Imagine you had to like mail a physical package to get everybody's consent. Like you could have done that kind of algorithm, but it would just be very, very slow. And so that's really when the era of trustlessness started, right? And so my answer, my very long answer, I guess, would be that because of inertia, things are not really going to change by themselves unless the new force shows up. And a lot of stuff, like they're just the way they are because that's how we got here, right? And new innovations don't always just propagate immediately. It just takes time, and particularly it takes people who are willing and able to build superior solutions to um, customers that leverage the new technology and that leverage the new paradigm. And eventually, that's how a paradigm replaces things, right? So even if you think about mobile, right? Like now we're all used to most of media has just kind of gone decentralized, and like this podcast, and it's on our phones where um, we can directly consume the content from anywhere, and that's been possible for probably 10, 15 years now. But it really, took 5, 10 years to pick up, and now it's become the default, right? And so By the time people already had iPhones and like the internet was around, for a long time it was still that the legacy media was the main way of people consuming that information because that's just how things work, right? And now we've kind of slowly replaced it with better options for consumers. And so I would think about it as the same way, right? You kind of things start out in this trusted environment, and we're now only slowly starting to replace one by one. And the only way to replace things is to offer a better solution to customers and to the market. And as we continue to do that, we'll continue to see more and more adoption of the trustless paradigm.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I really
J-
like how you also mentioned. Oh yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, yeah. Also, like a continuation on that thought of that adoption aspect. I know some crypto exchanges are adopting some aspect of proof of reserves, maybe as like a bridge to that. As like you said, like the trusted third party, like escrow comes in and verifies that they have like certain aspects on the balance sheet. Do you think that other exchanges will inevitably adopt some form of ZK verification, or do you see that being as like a sort of from the transition over from mobile phones, or like from like let's say mainframes to mobile phone transition? What do you think?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting example, and so the maybe the example that I would use to relate it to is um, YouTube, right, and how that kind of long search replaced media, and so for um, I'm not going to call it any individual channels, but most media outlets now will have a YouTube page, right, and they kind of have gotten to adopt that because that became the norm. If you went to them in 2007 or 2008 in the beginning of these platforms, and when you said, "Oh, you need to have a YouTube page," they'd probably say, "Why? You already have our distributions. This doesn't really make any sense. Maybe it's going to cannibalize the existing business line." And they didn't really have a reason to, right? And then eventually they were forced to because the other way of doing things was just so effective in the market that you didn't want to be left behind. And so I'd probably view it similarly, which is that if every exchange is centralized and you offer them the ability to do ZK by themselves, there isn't really a strong reason for them to do that, right? They might do it as a PR gimmick or, if it's really convenient, but there's going to be trade-offs internally, and it might be, maybe they are doing some things that are not quite um, correct, and by adding more transparency, it's going to expose that. But if we start to build great fully trustless EK backed alternatives, and those pick up steam, I think it's going to be more and more of a default assumption, right? And the pressure will just kind of keep going up on these exchanges of, hey, why don't you have a proof of reserves, or why haven't you adopted this paradigm the same way that it kind of happened to legacy media?
And just on this topic of why haven't more exchanges adopted ZK yet, do you believe that it's also due to any kinds of, say, potential technical barriers within ZK? Like, for example, the cost for generating these proofs, or maybe some potential latency that's associated with this proof generation? Are there any sorts of barriers that you see just on the development of ZK? And maybe if there's anything specific that you think uh, needs to be improved on to make ZK more widely adopted?
Yeah, I mean, so I can think of three primary reasons, and uh, one of them is cost, and the other two you guys will be able to solve. So I'll talk about the cost first. The ability to generate a ZK proof is just something that was very difficult, and so you'd have to batch these proofs, or you have to do all of these optimizations that basically ended up with a poor user experience and high cost, right? And so us as an exchange, right? There's a certain amount that we will collect in fees on each trade, and we try to be, competitive and a little bit cheaper than what you get in a centralized marketplace. But if the ZK cost of proving a trade is higher than the fees that you can get from the trade, then it doesn't really make sense, right? The business doesn't work. And so we're finally at the point now, and that really only happened over the last um, year, I would say, where the cost has dropped enough that it's profitable to run a ZK exchange, right? And so the way that I talk to the team about this is because your fees are proportional to the size of the trade, And so if you have $1 million trade, it's always gonna, you could like manually like buy a plane ticket and fly to deliver the check and would still be profitable, right? But um, so there's always a size at which is profitable, but that minimum kind of viable size used to be like $100,000 trade size, and then it went down to like 10,000, 1,000, and it kind of has continued to drop, and now it's at the point where it's below $1, right? And so if you make a trade that's less than $1 in value, we're going to be breaking even on the fee. And so what that means is it's already a very common pattern that you would have a minimum trade size. And so our minimum trade size is $1, which I think is about 10 times less than what other exchanges might have. It's still like a very reasonable UX, and you're at a point where you've already costs have diminished enough that now this business becomes profitable, right? But 2 years ago, that wasn't true. The costs were about 200 times more, right? So instead of a $1 trade, you need to make a $200 trade to be profitable. And so a lot of these things are really of like, as costs drop, it's not that the solutions become linearly better, it's an exponential problem, because at different barriers you're going to unlock new solutions that become viable. Now, that's the first problem. I think that's kind of all the smart people working on ZK technology are taking care of that, and costs are continuing to drop. The other two, I think, are a little bit more nuanced, right? And so I think one problem is just awareness. If you go to, even within the crypto industry, but particularly people who might be on the fringes of it, there's not that many people know about ZK yet, which is why you guys are fixing that, and I'm sure that soon everybody's going to know, right? But you need to really have heard about a technology bunch before people start investigating it and thinking about it. Could we apply this? And then there's still a long way from could we apply it to does it make sense and what's the benefit we're getting. And so I think exposure is really important, and so I'm glad that more people are talking about it, and as that continues, I think it's going to increase the adoption of ZK. And then the last piece, I think, is a little bit more nuanced, but I think about this a lot. It's ideological almost. So if you talk to a person who's building an exchange, they're usually going to be building a centralized exchange or a decentralized exchange. And technically, generally, if you're building a centralized exchange, you're not too concerned with proof of reserves and correctness and safety and those kind of things, because you made the decision to go with a centralized exchange. And then when you go to the decentralized exchange landscape, um, I don't want to say you can care too much about user safety, but maybe people tend to be very zealous about 100% decentralization and openness. And openness is great, but there are real trade-offs. And I think sometimes maybe there's a tendency in industry to bury our head in the sand and pretend that as long as we keep saying open and distributed and decentralized, that all these hard like latency and performance limitations don't exist, and they do, right? And so in reality, there's a trade-off here. And I think the trade-off that you're making as a user is that not every single thing is public and visible, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because if I'm a user and I trade on an exchange, do I really want all my trades to be public? Maybe, right? Maybe not. But in many other things of our areas of our life, privacy is actually a benefit and not a detriment. And so I think uh, in order to build a ZK solution, you need to be willing to say, hey, maybe we're going to build something that is not 100% out in the open because it's more efficient, but you still maintain all the key trustless guarantees, right? And you don't have to worry about your funds being lost or any of the things that are the actual concerns that we're talking about here, we've solved, right? But in order to do that, there isn't a free lunch. You're trading off that it's not going to just all be out in the open and public. And I think for 99.9% of users, that's a much better solution. And one way of thinking about that is, if the decentralized solution was so much better, why are people still using centralized exchanges? Right. The answer is because for most users, those trade-offs have not been made correctly. And so I think the ideological point is one there. In my opinion, it's our job to build the best products for people and to make the trade-offs in line with what the consumer wants, and not to be too too firm in having a really strong belief that everything needs to be public and open, and you're just going to end up with solutions that are not as good and therefore not as viable. And so I think the more you guys are talking about this, the more we're having this conversation, people are going to start to realize that it does not need to be a complete binary. Everything is public or everything is opaque kind of approach. There's a lot of really um, good options in the middle that serve users well. And so, because we've been using so many analogies from other technology in this conversation, the analogy that I give is probably how the internet came along, right? And so you had, probably you mentioned mainframe computing, and that was the way of doing things. And people would say, well, why would you ever want to have an internet or like distributed computing? It's just so much more efficient to have all your stuff in a single mainframe, right? And then the internet came along, and people basically took this new approach to networking, and they'd have a bunch of different computers that are all um, on yeah, that are kind of all available. And at the time, if you think about it, right, a lot of the ideology and some of that is carried through to Web3 was really focused on everything is going to be free and open and transparent. It was going to be like you and I, we are going to have our servers running in our basement with our own web page that we fully own. And then like I'm going to call your web page, you're going to call my web page. And that sounds cool, but most people don't want to run their own server, right? And so eventually what happened is um, you had a suite of consumer applications that basically took this new technology, right? Whether it's a YouTube or Facebook or all these Google, all these different companies, they took the possibilities of this new technology and they built a consumer solution that was good for people, right? And so what people actually wanted is to search the internet or to watch videos or to share things with their friends, right? And once those things happened and were made accessible to consumers, all of a sudden mainframe computing basically went away, right? And now it's to the point where if you go to what should be a super centralized environment of a data center, or you're doing like AI computing, even there everything is decentralized because, or is networking because these technologies have gotten so good because that's where the consumer demand is. And so I probably think about it similarly, right? You need for people to recognize that it is our job to serve consumers with the best possible technology and not to have black or white or 100% decentralized solutions. And once we're able to do that and we're able to deliver things that are better, it's probably going to cascade to just a lot more adoption and something that is just much better for everyone in the long term.
Absolutely. And I really liked how you mentioned those other kinds of nuances that are not, say, like as technical of a challenge, like say with costs, but how you also mentioned about the need for more awareness and more exposure for more people within ZK. I mean, even outside of the space, there's still quite a lot of people who don't really know too much about the importance of privacy. But once we have that settled, and once we have more people more aware for the need for ZK, maybe then we can have some more adoption. And even when you mentioned about kind of the other nuance relating to these trade-offs and how a lot of our solutions are, going from either end of the spectrum, but having that solution as what Habachi is working on with kind of instead providing this variety of choice where it doesn't have to be, say, like fully open and decentralized, or sorry, fully open and decentralized, but with those latency costs versus like a fully centralized solution, but has those security risks. So really great to hear those nuances. I was also wondering about some other advantages that ZK, or how the Habachi team phrases it, this proof of solvency has for users. I mean, we spoke about providing guarantees that, say, the user's funds are safe on exchange so we can avoid FTX-like situations. But how about traders keeping their positions and strategies private? I'm wondering what that looks like on the user's end.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I like to talk about the primary benefits because those are really easy for people to grasp, but a lot of these things are not um, uh, as simple because they're complicated systems. And if you get one thing better, it actually cascades into lots and lots of downstream improvements, right? And so two um, non-obvious benefits of just proof of solvency, right? So the privacy aspect is if I'm a trader and I have a specific trading strategy, right? And that is really my IP. I'm making money because I have a way of thinking and analyzing and acting that I want to be. Um, that I think is superior and that the market has validated as superior. Well, if I take that strategy and execute it on an exchange that's open and transparent and everybody can see what I'm doing, I'm eroding my own edge, right? And so it's going to make me more hesitant to use those exchanges. Or if I do, I might modify my strategy or I might add in all sorts of hoops that they sound like they're free, but in reality, it's going to end up with either you have less liquidity on the platform, you have maybe you don't have the top users, which means um, you don't get the demand for the type of innovation that's going to keep your exchange to be number one, have the best offerings, and you're also just going to have just less usage of the exchange, right? And so um, that's one element. The other is every time you have to worry about your reserves if you're in a centralized environment, right? Um, there is a risk that your money gets lost, and so counterparty risk is not zero. We don't, you know, we might not think about it until something like FTX happened, but a lot of these institutions they have to because they're businesses, and so if you talk to them, what they're really going to tell you is that they have the counterparty risk, or really in layman's term, the risk of the exchange going down or something like FTX happening, is they have that baked into their models, and so they basically charge a fee. I mean, it's not an explicit fee, but it's an implicit fee of how they price everything. Is they need to basically pad an extra buffer because statistically, if 1 out of 10 exchanges goes bankrupt and you lose 100% of your money, well, you need 10% more return from the other nine. And so for the consumer, what that ends up meaning is you have an exchange where you're going to get worse prices, or all of those costs just get passed down to you. And so getting some of these fundamental problems solved, all of a sudden you unlock lots and lots of extra buffer that's in the system that just starts feeding back to the end user and gives you better prices and better experience.
Absolutely. And I also wanted to transition our discussion. We talked a lot about kind of the need, the why, and also, the advantages surrounding the proof of solvency. But I also wanted to ask you a bit more about Hibachi's core design. So when you mentioned a bit before that you're working on addressing this trade-off, so providing users with that good UX with as less latency as possible while ensuring privacy. But wondering if you could just let us or walk us through some of the kind of the design considerations behind Hibachi's core architecture. So I know that you guys have integrated with Risk Zero's prover that also use Celestia's DA. So kind of wondering how those two complement each other and really form the core architecture for Hibachi.
Yeah, for sure. I would probably describe it using the example of how centralized exchange works, because that's, from a performance perspective, still where you get the best experience, right? And so if you think about Coinbase, right, the core flow of Coinbase is you send them money, the money then sits on a bank account that they own. You have no guarantee they're going to get it back. They then run their application, right, which runs in AWS somewhere. They run their exchange, they decide everything, they update all the balances, and at some point you withdraw, right? And it's pretty obvious what the risks in that architecture are. But the benefit of it is that they can run the exchange really fast because they know the funds are in a place, they have the money. And so any trade that you're trying to place, because they don't have to worry about what happens if the funds are outside the network, or just where is the money, they can just run a fast offchain application, and you end up with a better just matching engine, better, yeah, just better overall trading experience. And so what we did is we decided, well, that part actually is good, and we want to keep that, but we don't want to keep the part where we have a bunch of bank accounts and take people's money. And so the architecture of Habachi is, instead of sending us money and we give you an IOU, you will deposit your funds into a smart contract, right? And so the funds stay on chain, they go into a smart contract. In that smart contract, there's, you know, public open source rules for how the funds can be moved, and they can only be moved if there's valid transactions and valid ZK proofs corresponding to them. So you would send your money. We see that it's in the contract, it stays locked there until you decide to withdraw. And so we have the guarantee the funds are in there. We can run the web service, which is basically just where we built Coinbase and Binance's trading engine. And so you get the same latency, same speed. You can trade right away. And then what we do is we take all the transactions that happen and we'll continuously batch them and we'll settle them back on. So really what that means is, like, here's the transaction that happens. Pavel and Alice have now made $5 on their account. Michael has lost $10. Here's the new state of the exchange, right? And so we're going to compute ZK proofs. To do that, every proof is then verifiable by the contract. You don't incur any of these extra gas costs because all the all the transactions are secured. You just need the knowledge that they're valid and that the state change is based on real transactions. And so as you're doing that, then your values get to be updated on chain. And so if you wanted to withdraw, it constantly reflects that. From a user perspective, we want to abstract as much of that as possible because most people don't really want to think about the blockchain and where funds are, right? You should just kind of, though the guarantees should exist, but you shouldn't have to actively think about them as you experience. And so the way it works in practice is when you deposit, the funds are there and we just update them and you can trade. As you trade, everything updates live. And then when you want to withdraw, we process them in a batch. So you have a basically withdrawal processing, which will take about 10, 15 minutes. And then your funds are going to show up and they'll get removed from the system. Now, maybe you're a very impatient person like me and you don't like waiting 15 minutes for your funds to be withdrawn. And for that, we have an instant withdrawal option where you pay like a small fee. That I think it's currently 0.5%. And we'll just give you the funds in 30 seconds. And then we have some buffers where we reconcile everything and take it to through the default process. And so that's the main approach. Now, in that, you don't really you need a prover to be able to compute the CK proofs and settle everything on chain. And so that's where receiver comes in. That's where you need a party to be able to make this whole thing work. Celestia is important, but for a different reason, right? And that is what happens if tomorrow we shut down the exchange, right? Like maybe just power goes out and all the servers go down, and like, your funds are now still locked in the smart contract. How do you reconcile it? And because we want to be trustless, we've worked on building these mechanisms where you could then go and if we stop approving, you'd be able to just reconcile the exchange. And so what you'd have to do for that is to take the state of everybody's balances and positions, and then you can post approve, hey, here's the current state. Everybody now gets to withdraw, and then all the funds get returned to you depending on how you deposit it. But in order to do that, you need to have the information of the current state of the exchange. And so what we do is with Celestia, we've partnered with them to build a solution where we can post that state of the exchange to Celestia. But if you were paying attention to the other part of this conversation, if we just do that publicly, we're going to violate people's privacy because now you can see all of your trades. And so what we've done is we basically encrypt them in a private storage of Celestia. And in order to see the data, you would need a decryption key, which is basically housed by a third party. And so if anything goes wrong, you break glass in terms of emergency, people can get to that key and then they can unlock the data, at which point people's privacy is no longer existing. But if our exchange goes down, you probably are not as worried about the privacy as you are about receiving your funds, right? And the whole point is that it should never get to that point. But by having these mechanisms, people can interact with the exchange in a trustless way, and therefore we don't have to include all these buffers and counterparty risk fees.
Yeah, got it. And really liked how you mentioned that you kind of abstract a lot of those underlying details away from the users. So they don't have to, worry about all of that, but instead go through a very streamlined process when they're, say, trying to perform a trade. So really great how you're keeping the overall user experience as seamless as possible. And just on the topic for just user experience, what do you think we should prioritize to better optimize for a user's ideal trading experience? And I know that Habachi is also currently working on implementing some features with flash markets, and there's also the sub-accounting feature that's available on the platform. You guys also have multi-chain support as well. So I'm wondering how all of this can contribute to what you see the ideal user experiences, and also having benefits from this proof of solvency.
Yeah, I would say there's a few elements to it, right? And some of them are just places where the decentralized paradigm has not caught up with the centralized user experience, and we need to, as an industry, improve. And we're really focused on having all those gaps closed as much as possible. And then there's also things where centralized exchanges can learn from Web3. And so in terms of the centralized experience, what people get right is having a very feature-rich exchange. And so sub-accounting is an example of something that is really, really nuanced, but very important for pro traders, right? And so the basic idea is quite simple. It's that instead of you just have one account, and if you get liquidated, you're going to start losing all your money, you could have these different pockets and you have these different sub accounts, and you're going to segment your funds, and each sub account is fully isolated. And so therefore, if you have some really risky bets, you can limit your risk to that account. And it's the kind of thing that if you go to exchanges right now, if you go to some of those exchanges, they'll have it, but it's a VIP feature. And so you have to be like tier 5 or 67 or whatever system they have in order to get access to it. And so it's something that you need to kind of have a relationship with the exchange. You need to earn your rights to have this feature, which I think is, echoes off of our middleman part of the conversation of why should the exchange decide what feature you have based on what relationship you have with them, right? And so um, at the same time, the only exchange that really had this as a super intuitive first class citizen feature was FTX. And it's something that people really liked about it because you could just open these sub accounts and everybody had it. There was no gatekeeping. And so the kind of thing that decentralized exchanges will build last. You either won't have it at all, or they'll have it as like some convoluted flow where you go to the main thing and then there's a separate page and they're like, yeah, we added sub account. But that's not really how traders think about it, right? And so there's a lot of these types of features where you just need to build the foundation, right? And you can't just patch together a bunch of things and say, oh yeah, we have X, right? Like people will know. People want good experience, and what that means is feature richness. Um, the second part, which I think is really, really, really important, is meeting people where they are when it comes to their funds and moving their funds, right? And so this kind of comes back to the ideological place where a lot of decentralized exchanges will pick a chain, and that's just if you're running on a chain, you need to pick a chain, right? And then and that's okay. You'll run on some chain, and there's trade-offs with that. But then because they picked the chain, the assumption becomes, well, this is the only thing. This chain is better than the other chains, and so you should only be able to deposit from this chain, right? And so any user that's on a different chain is not going to be able to get to your exchange really easily, and they have to use like 100 different bridges and like all these complicated solutions, right? Well, centralized exchanges don't make that assessment. If you want to go to Coinbase, like I have Bitcoin, I have funds on Solana, I have an Ethereum, you can just deposit them, right? They don't care, and I think it's the same as important for us. It's meet the user where they are, right? And so what that means is if you want to deposit your funds on chain X or Y or Z, we should have chain X or Y or Z, right? And now for ZK exchange or provable exchange, that's extra um, possible because the actual exchange mechanism doesn't happen on chain. And I still think for others, there's ways to do it. It's just a little bit more difficult on the decentralized side. And the final extension of that, and this is something that we haven't quite reached yet, but I'm very excited about it, and I think about it a lot, is just it should be really easy to get your funds into the system and out of the system, right? And so right now, a lot of the applications, and ourselves, we're guilty of this, right? We start at, okay, well, the user has a fund in a wallet, and then from there, here's how they deposit, right? And there's a reason to do that because interacting with a legacy system is very difficult and tricky and painful. But most people don't start that way. They don't start by, you don't become a crypto user by having a wallet. It's like saying, the way you build a credit score is you start with a credit score and then you improve, right? It's like, well, you don't, that's not how people start. People have their funds and they'll be in some other, they'll be in a bank or they'll be in a credit card. And it's our job to make it really easy to get in and out of that system. And I think that's, something that we're really focused on, where we're still building towards compared to some of these other things that we've already included from day one. Um, yeah, I think those are the main things that are what kind of the decentralized or the Web3 world can learn and improve. On the other side, I think having exciting inventory is a really important thing, right? And so by virtue of being these big companies where you need to have bank accounts that are segmented and all of that, a lot of these centralized exchanges are kind of stale, and you only have the supported markets and here's the categories because that's the way that you do it officially. But in reality, people want to trade all sorts of things, and new coins pop up and new types of products, and I think it's really important to have a great inventory and to keep innovating on the type of things that you offer. And so that's something that I think bigger exchanges struggle with a lot of times because they don't have the organizational structure to allow them to be flexible and fun and meet the user where they actually are. And I think maybe this validates my point, is the only exchange that ever really did that is FTX, where they would have like fun things in there and have the meme coins, and they'd be aligned with kind of what's going on. And the reason they did that is because they built an exchange without in the centralized way without any of these like big company foundations. And so they got to be more cool, but they also didn't have any of the important trust mechanisms that you needed, and that's kind of why they collapsed, right? And so I think with ZK you can now finally build an exchange that is at the quality and experience of a centralized player, but you don't have to become a big company to do it. You could actually be very trustless, have a great experience, be very safe, and still have a small team and be nimble, and you don't have to turn into this, very big regimented company.
Yeah, absolutely. And really great to see just from that standpoint what ZK can enable, where, as you say, can have the same like high quality experience that we see in a lot of centralized exchanges, but even small teams can be working on this. So that's very promising. And wondering also, just on a kind of like a regulatory standpoint, how do you see ZK contributing to current regulatory standards relating to trading infrastructure? Do you see any kinds of potential challenges that may come by, or certain barriers that may actually be alleviated if we introduce this trustlessness component? Just wondering about your thoughts on that side.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, right? And so I think for some reason over the last few years, uh, the Web3 space has become associated with not wanting regulation or regulation being a bad thing. And there's some very obvious reasons for that I emphasize. If we don't want to just have the same middlemen regulate how everything is going to be conducted, but there is an important point to regulation and preventing things like terrorist financing and all these systems that exist, right? And so you can try to put yourself above the law, but that usually doesn't end very well. And that's why a great thing about democracy is people get to change their laws and the regulatory environment that way. We get to offer solutions that comply with that. And so I think in terms of adoption, ZK itself, I think blends itself pretty well. And this is actually true for the whole decentralized ecosystem to being compliant, because especially once you have some core guarantees about fund movement and rejecting bad funds for being able to participate in the system, it's very easy to audit where all the funds go and where the money is, and so by everything being open source and verifiable, I think it makes it easier to regulate. It does require some evolution in terms of how the regulatory ecosystem thinks about laws and how they should be applied, because they're still thinking about it in the trust-based way, right? As well, here's the middleman, here's the things the middleman needs to show us to make sure that like they're not doing anything nefarious. And the truth is a lot of that technology has now automated for us. So I think we should just recognize existing technology solutions, and that will alleviate a lot of the regulatory problems. The really exciting part of it is that vice versa, a lot of regulations and a lot of inefficiencies in the system only exist because you need this extra layer of verification, right? And so we talked about this a lot internally. The whole reason why you have audits and proof of reserves and regulations of, well, you can only you have to maintain this much cash reserves and all that kind of stuff. It's because it's built in a system where you don't have cryptographic certainty. And for us, it was very easy to implement proof of reserves. You just look at the smart contract, the funds are there, right? We don't need to hire any lawyers to or accountants to go and show all the bank accounts. It's kind of baked in. And so I think a lot of things that are inefficiencies in the current financial system come from the fact that it's based on trusted parties, and so you have to verify them. Or either you don't verify them, then people lose their money, or you do verify them, and you have a bunch of regulation and red tape and things that make everything slower and more expensive. And at the end of the day, every single, as much as I like accountants, I have nothing against them, but every single accountant you hire, every single consultant that you hire to show that your exchange is valid, that person needs to be paid. Those costs come directly out of the consumer pocket in some way or another, right? And so the more you can solve the regulatory valid concerns with technology rather than with people, the more cost savings get passed on to the consumer eventually.
Absolutely. And then just as a kind of like a last question before we close, I'm curious to hear about Habachi's long-term vision. So any kinds of maybe upcoming things on the roadmap that you see contributing a lot to the long-term vision for both what you see the ZK space evolving to, and also how you see Hibachi evolving with it.
Yeah, I mean, we have a very exciting set of challenges to solve. And so the way that I think about it is really it's our role to use ZK to build better solutions for consumers, right? This entire conversation has been about how do we build things that are better for customers. And there's a lot of big grandiose things that sound cool that we'll definitely get to, right? But you got to lock in one win first. And so we started with the current feature set, which is more narrow, and kind of how can we build a better perps exchange. But um, as we're reaching the point where we actually feel like we've delivered on that solution, and there's still things to be improved, right? And it makes sense to keep expanding. And so why just a better perps exchange? Why not a better exchange in general? And then why not? Why just a better crypto exchange? Why not a better exchange, right? There's other things that you might want to trade. And so there's all sorts of products and things that you do right now. I mean, exchanges can be very small or very big. And I think our focus is always going to be at each size of the exchange and scope of features, can we provide a better solution to customers than the alternative? And as we hit those barriers, we want to keep expanding and giving more and more things that we do better than the alternative. And so I think there's a long road of very exciting expansions, both in terms of the type of inventory that's on the exchange, the ways you can use it, the ways to onboard and offboard, maybe ways to not have to move your money out of the exchange because other types of financial solutions are already integrated there. And so I don't think we're going to run out of exciting experiences to build, but we want to do that in a way that's thoughtful and that kind of keeps the quality bar high at each step along the journey.
Yeah, and that all sounds great. It seems like kind of like a lot of thought was put into right navigating through this trade-off process, and in terms of timing as well. Just now with, as you previously mentioned, now we're seeing the costs of, for example, proofs lowering by almost 200 times. And we're finally at that stage where we can, integrate ZK with some applications, such as with what Habachi is building with provable exchanges. So really great to see all the strides that we're making, and also a lot of the applications that are being built from it. But really appreciate all the insights, Michael. And yeah, very excited to see what Habachi will be up to in the next couple of months. And we'd love to have you back again sometime.
Absolutely. Yeah, can't wait to be back. And it's fun talking about these things. I'm excited for what we're building as a community and as an industry. And I think ultimately consumers should benefit. And I think that's the one thing that we'll always put above all.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much again.
Awesome. Thank you.